He didn't want to be at work that day. There was nothing dramatic about that feeling, just routine reluctance. Another shift underground, another day in confined air and artificial light. And when the earthquake hit, he didn't feel it the way people above ground would describe it. There was no shaking floor, no swaying walls. Down here, it was deep vibration, a low, rolling thump that traveled through the rock before the ceiling came apart. Later, it would be measured at magnitude 2.1. At the time, all he knew was that something structural had shifted. They were working inside the Beaconsfield Mine in northern Tasmania on April 25th, 2006. 12 miners were underground. The rockfall was sudden, and one man was killed instantly. Todd Russell was buried beneath rubble, compressed in a way that made every breath shallow and strained. Dust filled the air. The pressure on his torso restricted lung expansion. Each inhale was deliberate. Nearby, Brant Webb was knocked unconscious. When Brant came to, there was no immediate sense of direction, just darkness, debris, and the realization that the mine had changed shape around them. They felt for a lamp and illuminated a refuge chamber that was barely larger than a table. The walls were steel, but that didn't make it safe. It just made it enclosed. Using their arms, they shifted rubble carefully to relieve some pressure from Todd's chest. Movement was slow and painful. Fine rock fragments had embedded into his skin. Sliding across debris felt like dragging across broken glass. The air inside the chamber was stagnant. Ventilation was compromised. Water seeped through fractured rock, murky, mineral-heavy water, which they collected and drank. Then they took inventory. There was almost nothing. The only solid food was a single muesli bar. They broke it into pieces, small and measured bites, not to satisfy hunger, but to maintain blood sugar and to keep them thinking clearly. Above them, rescue crews were assembling equipment and trying to interpret incomplete tunnel maps that no longer matched the underground reality. Below, they had no communication, no timeline, no confirmation that anyone knew exactly where they were. Just water, darkness, and one muesli bar. You're listening to True Crime Culinary. I'm your host, Leah Jack. Let's sink our teeth into this story. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary. I am your host, Leah, and this is a space where we combine my love for true crime with food history. I just kind of hope it's the podcast you didn't know you needed. This week, we're doing a survival story. I love survival stories, and I am inspired by all the Olympians who have so much grit and determination, and that those are two things you need to survive, as well as, ideally, some food. And since the Olympics are in Switzerland, I looked for a story that involved what we're talking about this week, muesli. Before we get started, hey, please remember to rate, review, and share the pod. It helps more than you know. And now, how did a Swiss health experiment end up 1 kilometer underground in Tasmania? Let us dive in. To understand muesli, you have to understand Switzerland in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Switzerland was becoming known not just for banking and neutrality, but for sanatoriums in response to the Spanish flu and tuberculosis, because they were hitting Europe really hard early in the 20th century. So across the Alps, clean air and mountain climates were marketed as therapeutic. Tuberculosis treatment centers were built in places like Davos. Hydrotherapy clinics and nutritional reform centers attracted patients from across Europe. Industrialization, meanwhile, had altered diets dramatically. Refined sugar and flour consumption increased. Urban populations grew, and digestive disorders and malnutrition were common. Doctors began experimenting with food not just as sustenance, but as preventative medicine. One of them was Maximilian Bircher-Benner. I just got to pause. One of my favorite names to say is Maximilian. It's kind of like Francisco in Elf. It's just like beautiful to say. Anyway, Maximilian, a Zurich physician who believed that raw fruits, whole grains, and nuts preserved natural vitality, was the important person for muesli. He rejected heavy meat-based diets common in Europe at the time. Instead, he developed a mixture for his patients that involved rolled oats soaked overnight, grated raw apple, lemon juice, nuts, and sometimes condensed milk. Simple, nutrient-dense, and mighty tasty, also equally easy to digest. Actually, muesli originally was known as Apfeldiätspeise, which is German for apple diet meal. The name evolved to muesli since the word for applesauce, I almost said it in German, is Apfelmus. Mus became muesli or little mash. It wasn't designed as breakfast cereal at first. It was clinical, measured, and prescriptive. In early Swiss sanatoriums, food was therapy, and muesli was part of that therapeutic model. So by mid-century, Bircher's ideas had diffused into mainstream European diets. Food manufacturers recognized something important. This mixture was cheap, shelf-stable, and adaptable. Companies like Biofamilia began commercial production in the 1950s, becoming one of the first industrial muesli producers in Switzerland. Later, brands like Alpen expanded internationally, marketing muesli as natural, wholesome, and modern. I gotta pause, before I forget. I did look up what is the difference between muesli and granola. After all, they share a ton of the same ingredients. The easiest answer is that muesli is completely raw and granola is baked. But they're very much similar ingredients for a lot of the same purposes and both delish. So back to muesli, back to brands like Alpen, they discovered compression. Once oats, nuts, and dried fruits were bound together with syrups, they could be shaped into bars. The muesli bar emerged as a portable evolution of Bircher's mash. The formula worked because it combined complex carbohydrates, simple sugars, fats, and fiber. Now you had an all-in-one compact rectangle that didn't require refrigeration, cooking, and it tolerated pressure. It also fit into pockets, which is how it ended up in the mine safety kits. A muesli bar is engineered for energy management. Oats release glucose slowly, the dried fruits spike glucose quickly, nuts provide sustained fat calories, and in cold environments, the human body burns glucose aggressively to maintain core temperature and brain function. So you kind of need something to keep the lights on, to keep the fire burning, as it were. Cognitive impairment for hypoglycemia can occur faster than many people realize, especially under stress. So in a dark chamber underground, maintaining mental clarity matters. This point is how I know I would not be coping well. I already don't like the dark. I don't even like letting my dog out at night to go into the darkness of the backyard. I feel a tiny bit of terror. But also, I have a very active imagination and have watched many a Lord of the Rings. So it's just, there's always a question of, but what's down there and will it come get me? But back to our muesli story. In a dark chamber underground, maintaining mental clarity totes matters. Not emotionally, but biologically. The single muesli bar Webb and Russell shared wasn't comfort, but it was more stabilization. Each small bite extended metabolic continuity. And you got to remember, they have to keep their cool. They have limited air down there, and so they need a way to maintain even breathing without hyperventilating, without kind of losing hope. And so any little bit of food that can kind of give you that cognitive stability, that ability for you to think clearly, absolute key. So now that we've covered the history of muesli, why it's important, and how it ended up in the pocket of one very unfortunate or fortunate miner, let's go into how rescues even work for mines. I was kind of curious about this because I've heard of a couple mine rescues. We've had a few big ones in the last few years, and so much of it is like organized chaos. So first, rescuers prioritize survivability. Famously, mines are very dangerous, not just because you're under a ton of rock, but also because air is something that can easily be cut off. So if there's some sort of collapse, not only are you in the dark and you don't have light, but you have very limited avenues for air getting to you. So the rescue teams use seismic listening devices, drilling probes, and acoustic sensors to detect signs of life so that they know where to try to restore airflow. In underground collapses, oxygen depletion and carbon monoxide buildup are major threats. Narrow boreholes are drilled first, not for extraction, but to send air, communication cables, food, and water. Widening a shaft is slow. Again, remember that if you're trying to get to a group of people or a person who is stuck in a tiny cavern or sometimes even a big cavern, that you don't know now the materials around that person or people, you have no idea what the structural integrity is. You don't know what new stuff has been kind of like knocked off. You don't know if there's electrical cables now open to being touched. Like there's so many risk factors that the first thing is just to get them air. Then is to try to figure out as much as you can about the space around them and how much you can safely drill without further collapsing or drilling too aggressively to cause secondary issues. At Beaconsfield, drilling teams worked for days to locate the refuge chamber. On day five, I have a hard time thinking about that because if you're in the dark, because they probably didn't have the lamp on the whole time because they didn't want to burn out the battery, that's my assumption. So being completely in the dark means you completely lose track of time. I mean, just being alone with your thoughts and breathing and one other person. You have nowhere to go to the bathroom. So you guys are probably just like sitting in it. Like I have so many thoughts. Anyway, on day 5, a small drill broke through. Air was sent down, then food, then communication equipment. The psychological shift from isolation to confirmed rescue often marks the turning point in survival cases because now you have hope. You have something very concrete that you can put your hopes into, and that changes how you see everything. From that point, the operation became mechanical rather than speculative. Engineers gradually widened the shaft. Extraction was performed one miner at a time through a reinforced rescue pod. So on May 9th, 2006, 14 days after the collapse, Webb and Russell emerged. And can you believe it? They walked, talked, they had lost a little bit of weight, but they had endured dehydration, compression injuries, and darkness, and still survived. I'm so amazed. Now credit where credit's due. Muesli did not rescue them. The engineers, the drillers, the rescue planners, toads did. But that one bar definitely extended their metabolic runway. From a Swiss physician experimenting with raw oats in Zurich Clinic to a compressed bar rationed underground in Tasmania is another example of how cool food history is when you take a step back and see how it travels through time. And I can't help but reflect on my favorite factoid. Not so much that it is still popular, it's that it was delicious food that was preventative medicine. As someone who struggled with an eating disorder, food has not always been my friend. It has been my enemy and my scariest monster for many a season. And to see stories where food is not just trying to be scaled as something processed and sold as much as possible, but it was made to basically capture sunlight and life and give it to somebody for a meal who is suffering, recovering, potentially terminal, I guess, is such a beautiful part of Muesli. And I really enjoyed reading how it was put together and kind of envisioning myself in the Alps in a time when there were so many questions about food itself. And also fruit was not super popular at that time. And so the fact that it was part of Muesli just makes me really happy. So I hope you find something that makes you happy today, tomorrow, forevermore. May it be a snack of deliciousness. And I hope to see you next week. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.